The sound didn't belong. Ethan Brooks surfaced from sleep slowly, the way a man does when rest never quite reaches him anymore. His neck protested immediately. Another night on the lumpy couch, another morning paying the price. The broken blinds let in stripes of November sunlight that fell across his face, and somewhere in his small house someone was moving around. Not Sophie. He knew his daughter's sounds by heart, the shuffle of her feet, the particular creak of her bedroom door, the way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one was listening. This was different. Adult footsteps, bare feet on linoleum, and that smell-rich, expensive coffee, the kind he couldn't afford, the kind that came in bags with foreign words and price tags that made him wince. His heart kicked into a higher gear. Someone was in his house, in his kitchen, making coffee like they owned the place. Memory crashed through him in fragments. Storm rain like bullets on windshield that curve on Highway 9. The sedan wrapped around the oak tree like crumpled paper. Smoke. Fire. A woman's face pale as death blood running from her temple, her lips forming words he couldn't hear over the thunder. "Help me. Please." Ethan sat up slowly, every muscle in his 37-year-old body protesting. The couch springs groaned beneath him, a sound so familiar it barely registered anymore. He'd given Sophie the only bedroom 3 years ago when everything fell apart when her mother walked out, and it became just the two of them against the world. The couch had been temporary. Everything in his life was supposed to be temporary. 3 years later, here he was. The sounds from the kitchen continued. Cabinet doors opening and closing, the soft clink of ceramic, water running, and then impossibly a woman's voice humming something under her breath. Ethan turned his head slowly, his neck cracking in protest. She stood at his counter wearing his white dress shirt, the one he saved for the rare occasions when he needed to look professional for parent-teacher conferences and foundation meetings he couldn't avoid. It fell to mid-thigh on her, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hair, he hadn't been able to tell the color last night in the darkness and rain. But now he saw it was a rich, chestnut brown falling in waves past her shoulders. She was pouring coffee into 2 mugs, moving with the casual comfort of someone who belonged there. When she turned and saw him watching, she smiled. Not a surprised smile, not an embarrassed smile. A knowing smile, warm and slightly amused, like they were old friends, and this was just another ordinary morning. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I hope you don't mind. I found your coffee. It's not great, but I made it work." Ethan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. His brain scrambled for words, for context, for any kind of rational explanation for why a woman he'd pulled from a burning car 12 hours ago was standing in his kitchen wearing his shirt, making coffee, looking completely at home. He started, then stopped. His voice came out rough, sleep thick. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Who are you?" The woman's smile didn't falter. She picked up both mugs and walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the worn linoleum. "Alexandra Hayes," she said, extending one of the mugs toward him. "But everyone calls me Alex. And you're Ethan Brooks, age 37, father of 1 licensed handyman, renting this house from Riverside Property Management." She paused, took a sip from her own mug, her eyes never leaving his. "Which as of 6 months ago is a subsidiary of Hayes Industries. Technically Mr. Brooks. I'm your landlord." The words hit him like a physical blow. The mug was warm in his hands. When had he taken it from her? But his fingers felt numb. His landlord. This woman standing in his kitchen in his shirt was his landlord. "Before we continue," she said, settling onto the worn armchair across from him like she'd done it 100 times before, "tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel." Ethan stared at her. The morning light caught in her hair made her skin seem to glow. She looked younger than she had last night when blood had streaked her face and terror had widened her eyes. Now in the gentle morning light, she looked maybe 30, maybe younger. Beautiful in that effortless way. Some people were the kind of beauty that came from good genes and better health care, and a life without the kind of stress that carved lines into faces and grey into hair. "How do you know my name?" The question came out harsher than he intended. Alex gestured toward the small dining table where his mail sat in its usual precarious pile bills, mostly all in varying shades of red and urgent. "I looked through your mail while the coffee was brewing. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to know who saved my life last night." Before Ethan could process that, the casual invasion of privacy, the matter-of-fact tone, the whole impossible situation. Footsteps sounded from down the hallway. Small feet hurried and excited, the particular rhythm that meant Sophie was rushing, that she'd forgotten something or remembered something or needed something. "Daddy, have you seen my—" Sophie appeared in the doorway, 8 years old, and all wild brown curls and sleep-rumpled pajamas, her backpack dangling from one hand. She stopped dead when she saw Alex. Her mouth fell open. Her eyes went huge, that particular shade of brown she'd inherited from her mother, wide with surprise and confusion, and that lightning-quick processing power that sometimes made Ethan forget she was only 8. Who Sophie started, then looked at her father, then back at Alex, then back at Ethan. "Daddy, who is this?" Alex set down her coffee mug and slid gracefully from the chair to kneel on the floor, putting herself at Sophie's eye level. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, that Ethan felt something twist in his chest. This woman knew how to talk to children. "Hi there, Alex," said her voice gentle. "I'm Alex. Your daddy saved my life last night. I was in a car accident, and he pulled me out right before the car caught fire." She paused, let that sink in. "Your daddy is a hero." Sophie's face transformed. The confusion melted away, replaced by something that made Ethan's throat tight. Pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride. She looked at him with those big eyes, and he saw himself reflected there, not the struggling handyman, barely making rent, not the divorced single father sleeping on a couch, but a hero. Someone worth being proud of. "Did you really?" Daddy, Sophie's voice was breathless. Ethan couldn't speak around the lump in his throat. He managed a nod. Sophie turned back to Alex, no trace of shyness now. "He's really good at saving people. One time he saved Mrs. Chen's cat from a tree, and another time he fixed Mr. Martinez's car when it broke down in the middle of the road, and he always knows how to fix everything that's broken." "I can tell," Alex said softly, and something in her tone made Ethan look at her more closely. There was sadness there underneath the polish. Something raw. "Your daddy is very good at fixing things." The moment stretched all three of them frozen in tableau. Sophie in her pajamas, Alex kneeling on the floor in a borrowed shirt, Ethan on the couch with cooling coffee, and 1,000 questions he didn't know how to ask. Then Sophie glanced at the kitchen clock and gasped. "Oh no, the bus!" She whirled toward her room. "I have to get dressed, Daddy. I have to get dressed. Go!" Ethan said, finding his voice. "I'll make you a lunch." Sophie ran her footsteps thundering down the short hallway, and then it was just Ethan and Alex again. The silence felt heavier now, charged with something he couldn't name. Alex stood slowly smoothing down the shirt that wasn't hers, and walked back to the kitchen. "She's wonderful," she said, not looking at him. "You've done an incredible job raising her." "Thanks." Ethan managed. He set down the coffee mug and stood, his body protesting the movement. He needed to make Sophie's lunch, needed to walk her to the bus stop, needed to hold on to his routine, the only thing keeping him anchored when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. But first he needed to understand what the hell was happening in his kitchen. "Why are you here?" He asked the question carefully, trying to keep the accusation out of his voice. "I mean, I'm glad you're okay. I'm glad you didn't die last night. But why are you still here? In my house, in my shirt?" Alex turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd woken up, her composure cracked. Just a little. Just enough for him to see the vulnerability underneath. "Because I woke up at 4 this morning in a stranger's bed, wearing clothes that weren't mine in a house I didn't recognize. And I panicked." She wrapped her arms around herself. "My car is totaled. My phone died. I don't remember most of last night. The doctors say that's normal with head trauma. But I remember you." Her voice dropped. "I remember your face when you pulled me out of that car. I remember thinking, this man doesn't know me, doesn't owe me anything, and he's risking his life for mine. And then I remember nothing until this morning." She paused. "So I made coffee. Because that's what I do when I'm scared. I make coffee and I try to regain control of the situation." Ethan stared at her, saw past the expensive haircut and the designer watch still on her wrist, saw past the confidence and the polish, and saw what he'd seen last night in that moment before the fire took the car, a human being terrified and alone, and desperately grateful to be alive. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. You can stay for breakfast. But then I need to get Sophie to the bus, and I have 3 jobs today, and—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "And we need to figure out what happens next. What happens next," Alex said, "is, I thank you. Properly." She walked to where she'd left her purse, designer leather, probably worth more than Ethan's truck, and pulled out an envelope. A thick envelope. She set it on the counter between them. "There's $3,000 in there," she said, "for saving my life, for letting me stay here, for the shirt I'm wearing, for everything." Ethan looked at the envelope, looked at her, looked back at the envelope. $3,000. Enough to cover rent for 2 months. Enough to buy Sophie new shoes, the kind that fit properly instead of being half a size too small. Enough to fix the check engine light that had been on in his truck for 6 months. Enough to breathe just for a little while. His hand moved toward it. Involuntary. Desperate. Then he stopped, looked at Alex, and said the words that would change everything yesterday morning, before the storm, before the crash, before everything changed. Ethan Brooks woke at 5:45 a.m. to the jarring buzz of his phone alarm. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures across the glass that he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. He'd fix it tomorrow. He was always going to fix it tomorrow. He lay on the couch for 30 seconds, allowing himself that small mercy, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles he'd been meaning to replace since he moved in. Another tomorrow project. His life was full of tomorrows. Then he swung his legs off the couch, felt his knees pop, his back protest, his neck crack in that way that made him feel older than 37. 3 years of sleeping on this couch had done a number on his body, but Sophie had the bedroom. That wasn't negotiable. That was the one thing he'd gotten right. His phone sat on the milk crate that served as a coffee table, and before he could stop himself, he opened his banking app. The number stared back at him, merciless and unchanged from yesterday, $143.67. Ethan closed his eyes and did the math he did every morning, the mental calculation that had become as routine as breathing. Rent due in 5 days. $725. He had 2 jobs confirmed today, maybe 3, if Mrs. Patterson's call about the leaking faucet panned out. If everything went perfectly, if there were no complications, no unexpected repairs, no parts, he had to buy out of pocket, he might clear $180. That would leave him with $323.67. Still $401.33 short on rent. And that was before groceries, before gas, before the electricity bill that was already 2 weeks overdue. He opened his eyes, stared at the cracked phone screen, one day at a time. That's what the counselor at the community center had said back when he could afford to go. One day at a time, Mr. Brooks. You can't solve everything at once. But sometimes one day at a time meant not solving anything at all. It just meant surviving until tomorrow when you'd do the same math and come up just as short. Ethan stood stretched, felt his spine crack in 3 places. The house was cold. He kept the heat at 60 to save money, and he pulled on the sweatshirt that lived on the back of the couch, the one with Brooks & Sons Engineering embroidered on the chest. His father's company. The one Ethan had worked for had been good at, had lost when the economy crashed, and the downsizing happened, and suddenly being the boss's son didn't matter when there was no company left to run. That was 4 years ago. Another lifetime. He walked into the kitchen bare feet on cold linoleum and started the coffee maker with yesterday's grounds. It was a trick he'd learned from a YouTube video. You could get 2, sometimes 3 uses out of coffee grounds if you didn't mind weaker coffee. And Ethan didn't mind. He'd learned not to mind a lot of things. While the coffee maker gurgled to life, he opened the refrigerator, took inventory. Half a loaf of bread, natural peanut butter. Where the oil separates grape jelly, a carton of eggs with 3 left. 1 slightly bruised apple, a half-gallon of milk with today's date on it. He'd planned to go grocery shopping today, but yesterday's emergency call to fix Mrs. Chen's burst pipe had paid only $45, half what he'd quoted, because Mrs. Chen was 83 and living on Social Security, and he wouldn't charge an elderly woman more than she could afford. Sophie's lunch peanut butter and jelly. Again. 3rd time this week. He made it carefully, cutting off the bruised part of the apple, packing it with a store-brand juice box and a handful of pretzels from the bag he'd bought on sale. It wasn't much. It wasn't what other kids brought to school. He'd seen the insulated lunch boxes with compartments, the organic snacks, the fresh fruit without bruises. But it was what he had. He packed it in her worn lunch bag, the one with the fading unicorn that had been her favorite 2 years ago. She'd never complained about it being old. She never complained about anything. 8 years old, and already she knew not to ask for things they couldn't afford. That broke his heart more than anything. At 6:15, he walked softly down the short hallway to her room, opened the door quietly. Sophie was curled on her side, her brown curls spread across the pillow like a halo, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant that had been her mother's last gift before she left. Mr. Trunk, Sophie had named him. She still slept with him every night. "Good morning, sunshine." Ethan sang softly the same way he'd woken her every morning since she was born. It was the song his own mother had sung to him, and her mother before that. "Good morning, sunshine. It's time to rise and shine." Sophie stirred, smiled before she even opened her eyes. "Dad," she mumbled, "that song is so old." "Old is classic," Ethan said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Old is proven. Old is old." Sophie finished opening her eyes and grinning at him. "Like you? Hey now." He tickled her side, gently made her giggle. "I'm not old. I'm vintage." Sophie sat up, rubbing her eyes. She was wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with the astronauts that were getting too small, the cuffs riding up past her ankles. He'd have to find new ones soon. Another expense. Another calculation. "Can we have chicken nuggets this week?" Sophie asked, and Ethan's heart squeezed. She knew the answer. She always knew the answer. But she asked anyway because she was 8, and she wanted chicken nuggets, and she was still young enough to hope that maybe this week would be different. Maybe next week, baby Ethan said the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. It was always next week. Next week when the big job came through. Next week when things got better. Next week when he could afford to be the dad who said yes instead of always saying maybe later. "Okay," Sophie said. And she didn't sound disappointed, which somehow made it worse. She smiled at him, trusting and accepting and completely unaware that her father was failing her in 1,000 small ways every single day. "Can you help me pick my clothes? I can't decide between the blue shirt or the yellow one." They picked out clothes together, the yellow shirt, Sophie decided, because it was sunny outside, and that meant it was going to be a good day. Ethan watched her get dressed, helped her with her socks, noticed that her shoes were wearing through at the toe. She'd need new ones soon. The school wouldn't say anything they never did, but he saw the other kids' shoes. The light-up sneakers, the name brands, the pristine white that meant they were new. Sophie's shoes were from the thrift store, bought 3 months ago, already too small. She was growing fast, and he couldn't keep up. They ate breakfast together, scrambled eggs, 1 egg each, and toast with butter spread thin. Sophie chatted about school, about her friend Maddie, about the science project she was working on. Ethan listened, asked questions, made her laugh. These morning moments were everything. When he could pretend he was doing okay. When Sophie smiled and talked and seemed happy. At 7:20, they walked to the bus stop together. It was 6 blocks they used to drive back when gas wasn't a constant calculation, and Ethan kept his hand on Sophie's shoulder the whole way. Protective, grounding, connected. Other kids waited at the bus stop with their parents. They wore new backpacks, designer brands with characters from movies Sophie had never seen because they couldn't afford the streaming services. They held phones, actual smartphones, not flip phones like the one Ethan had bought for emergencies. They wore coats that fit properly, not hand-me-downs from the church donation box. Sophie didn't say anything about any of it. She just held her worn lunch bag and smiled up at Ethan and said, "Have a good day at work, Daddy." "You too, baby," he said, and hugged her tight and watched the bus pull away with her face pressed against the window, waving. He waved back until the bus disappeared around the corner. Then he stood there alone on the sidewalk and whispered the prayer he said every morning. Keep her safe. Keep her happy. Let her not know how hard this is. Ethan walked back to his truck, a 1998 Ford, with 240,000 miles on the odometer and a check engine light that had been glowing for 6 months. It would cost $800 to diagnose and repair. He had $143.67. The check engine light stayed on. He pulled out his phone, looked at his schedule. 3 jobs. Mrs. Chen's burst pipe already done yesterday. The Martinez family's electrical rewiring that was this morning's job, and a toilet repair across town for a new client if he could fit it in. If all 3 went well, if he didn't hit traffic, if there were no complications, he might clear $180. The Martinez job was in a nice neighborhood, the kind where houses had 2-car garages and professionally landscaped yards, and kids who didn't wear thrift store shoes. Ethan pulled up to the address, checked it twice to make sure he had it right. The house was beautiful. White siding, black shutters, a porch with actual furniture, not plastic chairs from Walmart. Mr. Martinez answered the door, mid-40s expensive watch polo shirt with a corporate logo. He looked at Ethan's truck, looked at Ethan's worn jeans and faded company shirt, and Ethan saw it, that flicker of judgment, that moment of sizing up. Rich man looking at poor man and seeing exactly what he expected to see. "You're the electrician?" Mr. Martinez asked. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "Here to check the wiring in your garage." The job took 3 hours. The wiring was worse than Ethan expected, old dangerous fire hazard waiting to happen. He explained all this to Mr. Martinez, showed him the frayed wires, recommended a complete rewire. 2 days of work, $900 in parts and labor. Mr. Martinez's face went tight. That seems high. It wasn't. It was fair. It was what the job required. But Ethan had learned to read these moments, had learned when to push and when to bend. And Mr. Martinez was looking at him like he was trying to scam him, like the poor guy with the beat-up truck was inflating prices to make a quick buck. "I can do it for $650, Ethan heard himself say. "If you can pay in cash, save me the credit card fees." Mr. Martinez considered. That's more reasonable. Deal. Ethan left with $320 in his pocket. $65 for today's diagnostic, the rest due on completion. It was less than he'd seeded, less than the job was worth, but it was something. It kept the lights on for another week. He thought about his old life as he drove to the next job. When he was an engineer at Brooks & Sons, when he wore button-down shirts and sat in air-conditioned offices and didn't have to calculate the cost of every gallon of gas. When his wife was still his wife. When Sophie was small, when the future had felt solid instead of terrifying. That life ended 3 years ago. Ended when the company went under, when his marriage imploded under the stress, when Jessica sat him down at their kitchen table and said, "I can't do this anymore. I can't be a mother. I can't be a wife. I need more." She'd left 2 weeks later, moved to Seattle, chasing some dream of freedom of youth, of a life unencumbered by responsibilities. She sent child support for the first 6 months, irregular payments that came when they came. Then nothing. She'd disappeared into her new life, and Sophie stopped asking about her. Ethan chose Sophie, chose to keep her in the same town, same school, same friends. Chose stability over advancement, proximity over promotion. He could have moved, could have taken a job in another city where engineering positions were available. But that would have meant uprooting Sophie, taking her away from everything familiar, right when her world was already breaking apart. So he stayed, started the handyman business. Took whatever work came, slept on the couch so Sophie could have the bedroom. Did what fathers do, survive, adapt, endure. By the time he finished the toilet repair, quick job, $40, the client was generous and didn't haggle. It was 9:15 p.m. He'd worked for 15 hours. His back ached. His hands were stained with grease. His eyes burned with exhaustion. He checked his phone, $143.67 plus $65 plus $40 equals $248.67. Still $476.33 short on rent. The drive home was quiet. Dark. The storm was building in the west, clouds piling up like bruises against the dying light. Rain had started to fall by the time he turned onto Highway 9, just a mist at first, then harder, then hammering. Ethan's phone buzzed. Mrs. Patterson. Still okay to watch Sophie tomorrow, dentist appointment. He'd forgotten about the dentist. Another expense. Sophie's 6-month checkup. Required by the school. Would probably be fine unless there were cavities, which meant another bill he couldn't afford. His thumbs were clumsy on the cracked screen. Yes, thank you. I'll be home by 9. But he wasn't. Because right then, rounding that blind curve on Highway 9, Ethan Brooks saw something that would change his life forever. A luxury sedan wrapped around an ancient oak tree hood, crumpled smoke pouring from the engine, and a woman inside dying. And he didn't hesitate. He never even thought about it. He just pulled over and ran into the storm. The rain hammered against Ethan's windshield like bullets, each drop exploding in a burst of white before the wipers scraped them away. It was the kind of rain that made driving dangerous, the kind that turned roads into rivers and visibility into guesswork. Ethan hunched forward in his seat hands, tight on the wheel, his high beams reflecting off the sheets of water and somehow making it harder to see. He'd lost track of time. The Martinez job had run late, the rewiring more complex than he'd estimated, and then he'd gotten the call about the toilet repair on the other side of town. One more job, one more $40, one more drop in the bucket that never seemed to fill. Mrs. Patterson had texted twice. Sophie was fine, she'd said, watching a movie, but it was getting late. Did he know when he'd be home? Soon he'd texted back. Almost done, but soon kept stretching. The toilet repair had required a trip to the hardware store for parts. The hardware store was 15 minutes in the wrong direction. By the time he'd finished and gotten back on the road, it was past 9 p.m., and the storm was rolling in with the kind of fury that made the local news tell people to stay home. Thunder shook the frame of his truck. Lightning strobed the world white for a heartbeat, illuminating the road ahead in frozen detail, trees bending in the wind, water running over the curbs, the world drowning. Ethan considered pulling over, considered calling Mrs. Patterson to say he'd be another hour better to wait out the storm. But Sophie was waiting. Sophie went to bed at 9:30, and he'd promised her a bedtime story. Had promised he'd be home in time to tuck her in. So he kept driving, kept his speed steady at 40 miles an hour when the speed limit was 55, kept his eyes on the barely visible road. Highway 9 was a 2-lane stretch of asphalt that wound through forest and farmland, connecting his side of town to Sophie's school and Mrs. Patterson's house and all the jobs that kept them fed. He knew every curve, every dip, every spot where water pooled when it rained too hard. He knew the oak tree before he saw it. The curve came up fast. It always did a sharp left that caught newcomers off guard. Ethan had driven it 1,000 times. Started slowing down automatically, foot easing off the gas, hands adjusting on the wheel. Lightning flashed again, turning the world brilliant white. That's when he saw it. The sedan was wrapped around the oak tree, like the tree had reached out and grabbed it. The entire front end was crumpled accordion folded, the hood pushed back into itself. Smoke poured from under the crumpled metal, dark and thick, mixing with the rain. The headlights were still on, flickering weakly, casting crazy shadows that danced across the wet road. One of the tires was still spinning, making a rhythmic thump, thump, thump sound that Ethan could hear even over the thunder. He hit the brakes. His truck fish-tailed on the wet road, and for a horrible second he thought he'd lose control, thought he'd end up in the ditch or worse. But the tires caught, and he came to a stop on the shoulder 30 feet past the wreck hazard lights, blinking uselessly in the dark. Ethan sat there for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for his brain to process what he was seeing. Long enough for the practical part of his mind, the part that had been in charge for 3 years, the part that calculated costs and risks and consequences, to say, call 911. Don't get involved. You don't know who's in that car. You don't know what kind of situation this is. But another part of him, the part that had run into Mrs. Chen's burning apartment last year to carry her out, the part that had pulled Mr. Martinez's kid from the pool when the boy went under, the part that simply couldn't walk away when someone needed help, that part was already unbuckling his seatbelt. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911 as he pushed open the door and stepped into the storm. The rain hit him like a wall, cold needles that soaked through his clothes in seconds. He held the phone to his ear, already running toward the wreck. "What's your emergency car accident?" Ethan shouted over the wind. Highway 9 mile marker 23 single vehicle tree. Someone's trapped inside. I think thunder drowned out his words. "Send someone." "Now, sir, are you safe? Is the vehicle stable?" Ethan reached the car. The smell hit him first. Gasoline strong and chemical mixing with the smoke. The hood was crumpled against the massive oak trunk. Steam hissed from somewhere inside the engine block. The driver's side door was caved in. The window shattered into a million pieces. He looked inside. The woman was pinned. The airbag had deployed a white pillow pressed against her chest, but the seatbelt was twisted wrong, cutting across her throat instead of her shoulder. Her face was pale, deathly pale, and blood ran from a gash on her temple, mixing with the rain that poured through the broken window. She was wearing a business suit, black and expensive-looking, now torn and stained. Her eyes were open wide and terrified and struggling to focus. Her mouth moved. "Help." The word was barely a whisper. Can't breathe." "Sir," the 911 operator's voice crackled in Ethan's ear. "Sir, I need you to stay back from the vehicle until first responders." She's dying, Ethan said. His voice was steady even though his hands were shaking. I'm getting her out. Sir, you need to wait for Ethan hung up. Shoved the phone in his pocket. Under the crumpled hood, orange flames flickered. Not big yet, not a full fire, but growing. He had minutes, maybe less. He tried the door. It was crushed, wouldn't budge. The metal had folded in on itself, warped beyond opening. Ethan looked around frantically, no other way and no other option. The flames were getting brighter, the smoke thicker. The woman's eyes found his through the broken window, pleading. His truck. The emergency hammer. Ethan ran back through the rain, his feet slipping on wet asphalt, his lungs burning. Found the hammer in his toolbox behind the seats, one of those tools you buy and hope you never need. He'd bought it 3 years ago after reading about a mother who'd drowned in her car because she couldn't break the window. Never thought he'd use it. Back to the wreck. The flames were visible now, licking up from under the hood. The woman was coughing, choking on smoke. Her fingers clawed weakly at the seatbelt. Ethan swung the hammer. The remaining glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. He swung again. Harder. The glass exploded inward, safety glass, cascading like diamonds across the dashboard. The woman flinched away, protecting her face with her hands. I'm getting you out, Ethan said. He didn't know if she could hear him over the storm, over the roar of the approaching fire. Just hold on. He reached through the window, felt for the seatbelt. It was twisted, caught on something he couldn't see, pulled tight across her throat. She was gasping now, her face going from pale to blue. He needed to cut it. Needed his pocket knife, the one his father had given him 20 years ago, worn and reliable and sharp enough. Ethan pulled it out, opened it with shaking hands. Don't move, he told her, though she probably couldn't have moved if she wanted to. He slid the blade between her skin and the seatbelt, sawing through the tough fabric. It took seconds that felt like hours. The belt snapped. She gasped, a horrible whooping sound as air rushed back into her lungs. The fire was spreading. Ethan could feel the heat now, even through the rain. Could smell burning plastic, burning rubber, burning something he didn't want to identify. The woman was free, but still pinned by the deflated airbag, by the twisted metal of the dashboard, by her own body that didn't want to move. Come on, Ethan said, reaching through the window, getting his hands under her arms. We have to go. Now. She tried to help. Her legs kicked weakly, her hands pushed against the seat, but she was disoriented, hurt, not strong enough. Ethan pulled hard enough that his shoulders screamed, his back protested. His fingers slipped on her rain-wet suit jacket. She came through the window in a rush, her weight sudden and dead against him. He stumbled backward, caught himself, caught her, wrapped his arms around her, and lifted. She was lighter than he expected. Fragile. He could feel her ribcage through the suit jacket, feel her heart hammering against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he thought for a horrible moment that she'd passed out, that he was too late. But then she gasped again, and her fingers curled weakly into his shirt, holding on. Ethan ran, carried her away from the car, away from the fire, away from the death that was reaching for both of them. 20 feet. 30. The explosion happened when they were 40 feet away. The fireball lit up the night, turned the rain orange through heat that washed over them like a wave. Ethan felt it on his back, felt his shirt singe, felt the woman in his arms flinch and try to curl into herself. He kept running until they were on the far side of the road, until they collapsed together in the mud and grass. Rain hammering down on them, both of them, gasping and coughing and alive. The car burned. The oak tree burned. The world was fire and rain and thunder. Ethan pulled the woman into a sitting position, supporting her back with his arm. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering. The blood from her head wound was mixing with rain running down her face, dripping off her chin. But she was breathing. She was conscious. She was alive. You're okay, he told her, not sure if he was reassuring her or himself. You're okay. Help is coming. You're okay. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Her eyes blue, he could see now in the firelight focused on his face, with an intensity that made his breath catch. You? Her voice was rough, damaged from the seatbelt's pressure on her throat. You saved me. Anyone would have no. She shook her head weakly. No one was here. Just you. Her hand found his, squeezed with surprising strength. Thank you, thank you. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Red and blue lights reflected off the low clouds. Ethan held this stranger in the mud and the rain, and watched her car burn, and felt her heartbeat against his chest, and thought, I don't even know her name. But he'd remember her face forever. Would remember her eyes. Would remember the weight of her in his arms, the way she'd curled into him, trusting him completely, when she had no reason to trust anyone. What's your name? He asked. But she didn't answer. Her eyes had closed. She went limp against him, unconscious or asleep or something worse that he didn't want to think about. Ethan held her tighter, felt for her pulse, weak but there, steady but thin. And then the ambulance was there, and paramedics were taking her from his arms, and suddenly he was alone in the rain, watching them work, answering questions from police officers who'd materialized from nowhere. You pulled her out. Yourself, yes. Car was already on fire, yes. You could have been killed, yes. But he wasn't. She wasn't. They were alive, and that's all that mattered. The paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. One of them turned to Ethan. You coming? Ethan looked at his truck. Thought about Sophie waiting at home, thought about Mrs. Patterson, probably frantic by now. I can't. My daughter, we need her emergency contacts, insurance information. You have anything? Ethan looked at the burning car. It's all. He gestured helplessly. The paramedic nodded grimly. We'll figure it out. You did good tonight, man. Real good. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, taking the woman whose name he didn't know to a hospital he couldn't afford to visit. Ethan stood in the rain, covered in mud and glass, and her blood, and watched the taillights disappear. His phone buzzed. Mrs. Patterson. Everything okay? Sophie's worried. Ethan looked at the burning car, looked at his mud-stained hands, looked at the wreckage of what could have been a death turned into a rescue by pure chance and proximity. Everything's fine, he typed back. Be home in 20 minutes. But nothing was fine. Everything had just changed. He could feel it in his bones, in the adrenaline still coursing through his system, in the way his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd saved someone's life tonight, and somehow he knew it wasn't over. The drive home took 23 minutes. Ethan counted them. Counted each minute because it gave him something to focus on other than the way his hands trembled on the steering wheel, other than the blood still crusted under his fingernails, other than the smell of smoke that clung to his clothes and hair and skin. Mrs. Patterson was on the porch when he pulled up, wrapped in her quilted bathrobe, her face creased with worry. She was 78, lived 3 doors down, and had been watching Sophie on and off for 2 years. She never charged much, refused to charge what the service was really worth, always saying things like, "Oh, Ethan, you do so much for me," already referencing the leaky faucet he'd fixed last month, or the stuck window he'd freed the month before that. What happened? She asked as he climbed out of the truck, taking in his muddy clothes, his disheveled hair, the tears in his shirt that he hadn't noticed until just now. Ethan. Are you hurt? I'm fine, he said automatically. The lie smooth from 3 years of practice. Car accident on Highway 9. I helped someone. Is Sophie asleep on the couch? Waited up for you as long as she could, poor thing. Mrs. Patterson studied him more closely, her sharp eyes missing nothing. You're sure you're okay? You look like you've been through hell. Long day. Another non-answer. Thank you for watching her. I'll get her to bed. Ethan. Mrs. Patterson's voice stopped him at the door. That person you helped, are they all right? He thought about the woman's pale face, the blood, the way she'd gone limp in his arms right before the ambulance arrived. I don't know. I hope so. Inside, Sophie was curled on the couch under her favorite blanket Mr. Trunk clutched to her chest. She'd fallen asleep with the TV still on, some cartoon playing on loop. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her breathe. 8 years old, his whole world. The reason he got up every morning, the reason he worked 15-hour days, the reason he didn't give up when everything felt impossible. He turned off the TV, carefully scooped her into his arms. She'd gotten heavier, kids did, that grew when you weren't looking, but he could still carry her. Would always be able to carry her no matter how big she got. That's what fathers did. Daddy, she mumbled against his shoulder as he carried her down the hallway. Shh, I've got you, baby. You're late. I know, I'm sorry. Mrs. Patterson said there was an emergency. There was. But it's okay now. Go back to sleep. He laid her in her bed, pulled the covers up to her chin, kissed her forehead. She smelled like lavender soap and childhood and everything pure and good in his world. He stood there in the dark, listening to her breathing, even out, feeling his heartbeat finally start to slow. Then he went back to the living room and collapsed on the couch that served as his bed. He should shower, should clean up, should do something other than sit here in the dark with mud drying on his clothes and his mind replaying the crash, the fire, the woman's face. But he couldn't move. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving him hollow and exhausted, and somehow more awake than he'd been all day. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, probably the police needing more information for their report. He answered, voice rough, "Hello, Mr. Brooks." A woman's voice, professional and polished. "This is Mercy General Hospital. We have you listed as the only point of contact for our Jane Doe patient from tonight's accident. She's asking for you." Ethan sat up straighter. "She's conscious?" "Yes. She woke up about 20 minutes ago. She's been quite insistent that we contact you. Would you be able to come in? She needs someone here, and we've been unable to locate any family." He looked at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. Looked at the closed door to Sophie's room. Looked at Mrs. Patterson's darkened house visible through his window. "I can't leave my daughter," he said. "Not tonight. But tell her." He stopped. Tell her what? He didn't even know this woman. Didn't know her name, her situation, anything beyond those few minutes in the rain when he'd held her life in his hands. Tell her I'm glad she's okay. She really is insisting I'll try to come by tomorrow. But I can't tonight. I'm sorry. He hung up before the hospital could argue. Sat in the dark. Thought about the woman lying in some hospital bed alone and injured, and asking for the only person she knew in this moment, a stranger who'd pulled her from a burning car. But Sophie was asleep down the hall, and she came first. Always. Ethan finally forced himself up, forced himself to shower. The hot water turned brown running off him, carrying away mud and glass and the smoke smell that had soaked into his skin. He scrubbed until his skin hurt, until he was pink and raw and clean. Put on fresh clothes. Checked on Sophie one more time, still sleeping, still safe. Then he went back to the couch, lay down and stared at the ceiling. His mind wouldn't shut off. Kept replaying the moment he'd seen the car, the decision to pull over, the weight of her in his arms. 3 seconds. That's all it had been. 3 seconds when he could have kept driving, could have told himself someone else would help, could have protected himself from whatever complications this would inevitably bring into his carefully balanced life. But he hadn't. Had never even considered it, really. Because that's not who he was. That's not who he'd ever been, even when life had beaten him down, even when he was barely surviving himself. Some things you just did because they needed to be done. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time he didn't answer. Turned the phone face down on the milk crate and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come easy. When it finally did somewhere around 2 a.m., his dreams were full of fire and rain and a woman's blue eyes staring at him with an intensity that felt like recognition, like she knew something about him that he didn't know about himself. He woke up 3 times to check on the woman, to check vital signs that weren't his to check, to make sure she was still breathing even though she wasn't there, was miles away in a hospital bed. Old habits from when Sophie was a baby, and Sid's statistics kept him awake every night for the first year. The checking, the constant vigilance, the fear that if he stopped watching for even a moment, something terrible would happen. At 5:45 a.m. his alarm went off. Another day, another morning, another round of calculations and job calls and keeping all the plates spinning. He dragged himself off the couch, every muscle protesting his body feeling like it had been in the car crash instead of just pulling someone out of it. Sophie emerged from her room at 6:30, already dressed for school, her backpack hanging off one shoulder. "You look tired, Daddy." "Little bit," he admitted. "But I'm okay. Mrs. Patterson said you helped someone last night, that you saved them. I did what anyone would have done." Sophie looked at him with those wise beyond her years eyes. "That's not true. Most people would have kept driving." He couldn't argue with that, didn't try to. They went through their morning routine breakfast, lunch, packing, walk to the bus stop. Everything normal, everything routine. Except Ethan kept checking his phone, kept waiting for another call from the hospital, another unknown number, bringing news he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The call came at 8:15 after Sophie's bus had left, after Ethan had climbed into his truck and started the engine. "Brooks, this is Mercy General again. I apologize for calling so early, but our patient discharged herself this morning against medical advice. She left your address as her destination. We just wanted to give you a heads up." Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She what?" She was quite insistent. "Frankly, we're concerned. She should be under observation for at least 24 hours, but she's an adult, and we can't force her to stay. We tried calling her emergency contacts, but the numbers we got from her insurance company all went to voicemail. She said you were the only person she knew in the area. This didn't make sense. None of this made sense. But I just pulled her out of the car. I don't know her. That's what she said. But she also said you saved her life, and that means something to her. I'd appreciate it if you could convince her to come back for the observation period." The call ended. Ethan sat in his driveway staring at nothing, feeling his carefully controlled life starting to tilt off axis. He had 3 jobs today. He had rent due in 4 days. He had a daughter to pick up from school at 3 p.m. and dinner to make and homework to supervise, and a life that didn't have room for complications. But a woman was coming to his house, a woman he'd saved, a woman who apparently had nowhere else to go. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from a number he didn't recognize. "I'm sorry to impose. I'll only stay long enough to properly thank you. I promise I'm not crazy, just grateful and a little lost. Alex. Alex. So that was her name." Ethan put his head in his hands, took a deep breath, made the same decision he always made when life got complicated: deal with it one moment at a time. He texted back, "I'll be home in an hour. Stay safe." Then he started the truck and headed to his first job, trying not to think about what he'd find when he got home. When Ethan finally pulled into his driveway 3 hours later, the first job had run long, a simple leak turning into a corroded pipe that needed replacing. A black sedan sat at the curb in front of his house. Not the one from the wreck. This one was pristine, expensive-looking, with tinted windows and chrome that gleamed in the November sun. His stomach twisted. She was here. Actually here. He sat in his truck for a moment, gathering himself, trying to think of what to say, how to handle this, what the protocol was for a stranger you'd saved showing up at your house uninvited. Did this happen to other people? Was there a guidebook for this? Before he could talk himself into driving away, the sedan's back door opened and she stepped out. Alexandra Hayes. Alex. The woman from the crash. But she looked nothing like the broken, bloody figure he'd pulled from the wreck. She wore a crisp white business suit tailored perfectly, her brown hair falling in glossy waves past her shoulders. No visible injuries except for a small bandage at her temple where the wound had been. She stood straight, confident, put together in a way that made Ethan suddenly aware of his stained work jeans and torn shirt. Their eyes met across the lawn. For a moment, neither moved. Then she smiled. Tentative, vulnerable, nothing like the CEO confidence she projected, and started walking toward him. Ethan got out of his truck slowly, met her halfway across the brown grass he kept meaning to recede but never had time for. "Mr. Brooks," she said, and her voice was the same as he remembered from last night, rough and grateful. "Thank you for letting me come. I didn't really." He trailed off. Didn't know how to finish that sentence. Didn't let you, didn't invite you, didn't ask for any of this. He settled on, "Are you okay?" "The hospital said you left against medical advice." "I'm fine. Mild concussion, some cuts and bruises. They wanted to keep me for observation, but I've been in hospitals before. I know when I need to be there and when I don't." She gestured toward his house. "May we talk? I promise I won't take up much of your time." Ethan looked at his watch. 11:45 a.m. Sophie didn't get out of school until 3:30. He had another job at one Hazaduras that he'd already have to cancel if this conversation ran long. But the woman in front of him had driven across town against medical advice to see him. "Okay," he said. "Come in." Inside the house looked exactly as shabby as it always did. Worn furniture, peeling paint, the general air of a place that was functional but not cared for. Not because Ethan didn't care, but because he was always too busy or too tired or too broke to do anything about it. He saw it through her eyes, now saw her taking in the details. The couch with the dent where he slept, the milk crate coffee table, the water stains on the ceiling, the duct tape on the recliner's torn arm. But if she judged, she didn't show it. She just smiled politely and sat when he gestured toward the recliner, perching on the edge, like she might need to leave quickly. "Can I get you something water coffee?" The coffee would be terrible instant, all he could afford right now, but hospitality was hospitality. "I'm fine, thank you." She set her designer purse on the floor carefully, like maybe it cost more than his monthly rent. Probably did. "Mr. Brooks, Ethan." "Please." "Ethan." She said his name like she was testing it, learning the shape of it. "I came to thank you, properly, for saving my life last night. I already told you I know what you told the hospital, that anyone would have done it, that it wasn't a big deal, that you don't want recognition." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes, and yes, they were blue, bright blue, striking against her dark hair, intense on his face. "But I need you to understand something. I was dying in that car. I couldn't breathe. The seatbelt was crushing my throat. The fire was spreading. I was conscious enough to know what was happening. Conscious enough to realize I was going to burn to death or suffocate, whichever came first." Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "And then you were there. A stranger. Someone who stopped when you had no reason to stop, who risked your life when you had no obligation to. You could have driven past. Most people would have. The statistics on bystander intervention are depressing. But you didn't. I couldn't just... That's the point. She cut him off gently. You couldn't, because that's who you are. Because stopping to help isn't a choice for you, it's a compulsion. And people like you are rare. Rarer than you probably realize. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. Sat in his cheap clothes on his worn couch and looked at this polished, powerful woman and felt like they were speaking different languages. So I came to thank you, Alexandra continued, and to offer some small recompense for your trouble. She reached into her purse, pulled out an envelope, set it on the milk crate between them with a soft thud that suggested weight substance. Ethan looked at the envelope. Didn't touch it. There's $3,000 in there, Alexandra said. I know that's not adequate payment for a human life. Nothing would be. But it's something. For your time, for ruining your clothes, for whatever inconvenience this has caused, $3,000? Ethan stared at the envelope. His brain did the math automatically, couldn't help itself rent covered for 4 months. Sophie's shoes, new ones that fit. The check engine light fixed. Groceries without counting pennies. A buffer breathing room, the kind of financial security he hadn't felt in 3 years. His hand moved toward it. He watched his own fingers reaching disconnected from his body, driven by pure, desperate need. Then stopped, pulled back, looked at Alexandra Hayes and felt something hot and sharp in his chest. Shame, maybe, or pride, or the crushing realization that if he took this money, he'd be proving something he'd spent 3 years trying to disprove, that everything had a price, that dignity could be bought, that saving someone's life was transactional. No, he said. The word came out harder than he intended. Alexandra blinked, clearly surprised. No. Take it back. Ethan stood up, needing distance, needing air. I didn't save you for money. I saved you because you were dying. Because that's what decent people do. You don't pay someone for basic human decency. I'm not trying to... Yes, you are. His voice was rising, and he couldn't stop it. Couldn't control the anger that was surging up from somewhere deep and wounded. You're trying to make this okay. Trying to balance some ledger in your head. Trying to turn what happened into a business transaction. But it wasn't. It isn't. It was just... He stopped struggling for words. It was just one person helping another person. That's all. Alexandra stared at him. She'd gone very still, her face carefully blank in that way people had when they were trying not to show emotion. I see. Do you... Ethan couldn't stop now. The words pouring out 3 years of frustration and exhaustion. Because I'm not sure you do. I'm not sure someone like you can understand what it means to have people look at you and only see what they can buy. I work 3 jobs. I sleep on a couch because my daughter has the bedroom. I count pennies at the grocery store, and I've worn the same work boots for 2 years because I can't afford new ones. And you know what? I have more dignity than some rich person throwing money at me to make herself feel better. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood there, breathing hard, realizing he'd probably just insulted a woman who was trying to be kind, who'd done nothing wrong except try to express gratitude in the only way she knew how. I'm sorry, he said softer now. That was unfair. You didn't deserve that. No, Alexandra said quietly. You're right. She picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, then carefully placed it back in her purse. I was trying to make myself feel better. Because feeling helpless, feeling like I owe someone a debt I can never repay, it's uncomfortable. It's easier to write a check than to sit with that discomfort. She stood up, smoothed down her suit. Thank you for your honesty, and thank you again for saving my life. I promise I won't bother you again. She walked toward the door. Ethan watched her go, feeling something twist in his gut. Regret, maybe. Or the sense that he'd just made a mistake, though he wasn't sure what kind. "Wait," he called when her hand was on the doorknob. She turned back. "I didn't mean to." He struggled for the right words. "I appreciate the gesture. Really. But I just couldn't. It wouldn't be right. Not for me." "I understand." Her smile was sad, knowing. "You're a proud man. That's not an insult. Pride has kept you going when everything else failed. I can respect that, even if I can't fully understand it." She opened the door, paused on the threshold. "For what it's worth, I grew up in foster care. 15 different homes in 16 years. I know what it's like to have nothing to count, every penny, to feel like accepting help is admitting defeat. I built everything I have from that place. And I forgot somewhere along the way that not everyone wants to be saved with a checkbook." Then she was gone. The black sedan pulled away from the curb, leaving Ethan standing in his empty doorway staring at the space where she'd been. He closed the door, sat back down on the couch, put his head in his hands. Sophie's voice drifted through his mind. "You saved her life, didn't you?" Yes, he had, and somehow that simple act had created a connection he didn't know how to navigate between two people from completely different worlds who should have had nothing to say to each other, but who couldn't quite walk away. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number had to be her. Somehow she'd gotten his number from the hospital records. "I'm sorry I offended you. That wasn't my intention. I just want you to know if you ever need anything, ever, please call me. You saved my life. That means something. Whether you take the money or not, whether you call or not, please know if you need me. I'm here." Below the message was her contact information. Alexandra Hayes, CEO, Hayes Industries. An address in the expensive part of town, a business phone, an email. Ethan stared at the screen. Saved her contact without quite knowing why. Then he deleted the text, grabbed his keys, and headed to his next job. Because pride was one thing, but rent was still due in 4 days, and no amount of dignity put food on the table. For 3 days, Ethan tried to forget about Alexandra Hayes. He threw himself into work with a focus that bordered on obsession, fixed Mrs. Chen's leaky faucet, and refused her offer of payment because she was on a fixed income and he could tell she needed every dollar. Rewired the Martinez's garage, 2 days of work for $650 in cash that he counted 3 times before believing it was real. Drove across town to replace a water heater for a family he'd never met, who'd found his number on Craigslist, and didn't haggle when he quoted the price. By Friday afternoon, he'd made enough to cover rent with $83 left over. It was a miracle, or close to it, the kind of week that almost never happened, where every job went smoothly, and every client paid promptly, and nothing broke that he didn't have parts for. He deposited the rent check into his landlord's payment box with a relief so profound it made his hands shake. 1 more month of stability. 1 more month of keeping the roof over Sophie's head, 1 more month of not failing. But at night, after Sophie was asleep, and he lay on the couch staring at the water-stained ceiling, his mind kept drifting back to those 15 minutes in his living room, to Alexandra Hayes sitting in his recliner offering money he desperately needed, and the way he'd thrown it back in her face like an insult. Had he been right? He couldn't tell anymore. Pride was important, teaching Sophie that dignity mattered, that they might be poor, but they weren't desperate that some things couldn't be bought. But pride also didn't buy new shoes when Sophie's were wearing through at the toe. Pride didn't fix the check engine light in his truck. Pride didn't erase the bone-deep exhaustion of working 3 jobs and still coming up short. His phone sat on the milk crate beside him. Alexandra's contact information saved in his phone like a secret he wasn't ready to admit he was keeping. He'd pulled it up a dozen times, thumb hovering over the call button, before exiting out and setting the phone aside. What would he even say? Sorry I yelled at you for trying to be generous. Sorry I let my pride get in the way of accepting help my daughter actually needs. Sorry I can't figure out how to be grateful and dignified at the same time. Friday evening he picked Sophie up from school and found her limping slightly, favoring her right foot. His heart dropped. "What's wrong with your foot, baby?" "Nothing," Sophie said too quickly, which meant something. "Just a blister." "Let me see." They got home and he sat her on the couch, gently removed her shoe and sock. The blister was angry and red, taking up most of her heel. The shoe had been rubbing there for weeks, probably the worn fabric exposing seams that dug into her skin. "Why didn't you tell me it hurt?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the guilt out of his voice. "It wasn't that bad." Sophie pulled her foot back, curled it under herself. "And I know we can't afford new shoes right now. I heard you on the phone with the electric company. About the extension." 8 years old. She shouldn't know words like extension. Shouldn't know that sometimes Daddy had to beg utility companies for payment plans. Shouldn't know any of this. "We'll get you new shoes this weekend," Ethan promised, doing the mental math even as he said it. The thrift store was having a sale. If he could find sneakers in her size for under $10, they'd still have enough for groceries. "Okay," Sophie said, but she didn't sound convinced. She'd learned not to trust promises of new things. They happened sometimes, but not always, and never when she expected them. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Ethan pulled up his bank account, looked at the number $83.67. Then he pulled up Alexandra's contact. Then he closed the app and threw his phone onto the couch cushion like it had burned him. No, he'd made his choice. He'd stand by it. Sophie would get new shoes from the thrift store, and it would be fine, and they'd keep going the way they always had, one day at a time, one expense at a time, one small crisis at a time. He didn't need Alexandra Hayes's money. Didn't need anyone's help. They were fine. They weren't fine. But admitting that felt like failure, and Ethan Brooks didn't fail his daughter. He couldn't. It was the only rule he had left. Alexandra Hayes sat in her corner office on the 30th floor of the Hayes Industries building and tried to focus on the quarterly earnings report spread across her desk. The numbers were good, excellent even. The tech investment firm she'd built from nothing was on track to break into the top 3 in the state. Investors were happy. The board was happy. Every metric that mattered said she was succeeding. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the city sprawling below, to the traffic that snaked through downtown and disappeared into neighborhoods she never visited, where people like Ethan Brooks fixed pipes and raised daughters and survived on pride when money ran out. It had been 3 days since their awkward confrontation in his living room. 3 days since he'd essentially told her to keep her money because it insulted him. 3 days of Alexandra replaying that conversation in her head, trying to understand what she'd done wrong, how offering gratitude had turned into delivering offense. In her world, money solved problems. That's what it was for. When she'd needed a software engineer, she'd hired one. When the company needed new servers, she'd bought them. When her executive assistant's mother got sick, Alexandra had paid the medical bills without being asked, because that's what power was for solving problems, efficiently removing obstacles, making people's lives easier. But Ethan Brooks didn't want his problems solved, or at least didn't want them solved with her money, which left Alexandra in unfamiliar territory, wanting to help someone and having no idea how. A knock on her door pulled her attention back to the present. Her assistant Marcus, mid-20s, competent, too polite to point out when Alexandra was clearly not paying attention, stuck his head in. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes, Miss Hayes." Alexandra glanced at her watch. 2:55 p.m. Right. The meeting she'd been dreading all day, where 12 executives would sit around a conference table and ask pointed questions about resource allocation and market strategy, and she'd have to pretend her mind wasn't elsewhere. "Thank you, Marcus. I'll be right there." He hesitated. Are you all right? You've seemed distracted lately. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine, and Marcus knew it, and probably everyone else in the building knew it too. Alexandra Hayes, who never missed a detail, who never let personal life interfere with business, had spent 3 days staring out windows and forgetting about meetings until the last minute. The board meeting was exactly as tedious as she'd expected. 12 middle-aged men in expensive suits asking questions they already knew the answers to, protecting their positions and stock options. Alexandra answered automatically, her responses polished from years of practice. Yes, the Martinez account was proceeding on schedule. No, they hadn't encountered unexpected obstacles. Yes, projected returns were in line with forecasts. But somewhere around the 40-minute mark, as the CFO droned on about depreciation schedules, Alexandra's mind drifted again. She was thinking about Ethan's house, the worn furniture, the duct-taped recliner, the way he'd offered her coffee, like it was something special, even though she knew his coffee was terrible, could tell from the instant granules in his cabinet. The way he'd stood up when he got angry, like his body couldn't contain all the dignity he was trying to hold on to. The way his daughter's drawings covered the refrigerator, crude, colorful, clearly treasured. The way he'd checked his watch 3 times during their conversation, not because he was bored, but because he had somewhere to be, some job to get to, some obligation he couldn't afford to miss. She thought about him lying on that lumpy couch every night, because he'd given his daughter the only bedroom. Thought about him counting pennies at grocery stores, wearing boots with holes in them, driving a truck that was probably held together with duct tape and prayer. And she thought about herself sitting in a corner office 30 floors above the city, earning more in a month than Ethan probably made in a year, able to solve any problem with a phone call or a checkbook. Except this one. Miss Hayes Alexandra blinked. The entire board was staring at her. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? The CFO looked annoyed. I asked about your opinion on the proposed acquisition of the Riverside Property Management portfolio. Riverside, the name registered. That was the company that managed Ethan's rental house, one of dozens of small real estate firms Hayes Industries had absorbed over the past few years, part of their diversification strategy. What's the status of that acquisition? Alexandra asked. Nearly complete. We're finalizing paperwork next week. 24 residential units valued at $2.1 million total. All low-income rentals, decent steady revenue stream, minimal maintenance required. Low-income rentals. Ethan's house. She owned it or would own it in a week. An idea formed. Reckless, probably. Definitely overstepping. But then again, Alexandra Hayes hadn't built an empire by playing it safe. Put me down as the primary investor on that acquisition, she said. I'll handle it personally. The CFO raised an eyebrow. It's a small portfolio, Miss Hayes, hardly worth your direct involvement. Nevertheless. The board exchanged glances but didn't argue. Alexandra Hayes's instincts about investments were legendary. If she wanted to personally handle a small property portfolio, there was probably a reason. If only they knew the reason was one stubborn handyman who'd refused her money and somehow wormed his way into her conscience. After the meeting, Alexandra returned to her office and pulled up the Riverside Property Management files. Found Ethan's address, his lease agreement, the record of his rent payments all on time, all exactly $725, never a dollar more or less. She noted the notes from the previous property manager. Tenant does maintenance work in exchange for minor rent reductions. Reliable. No complaints. So he was trading his skills for lower rent. Smart. Necessary, probably. Another way of surviving when money was tight. Alexandra leaned back in her chair, studying the file. Thinking. There had to be a way to help him without insulting him, without triggering that fierce pride that had turned her gratitude into offense. She just had to figure out what it was. Her phone buzzed. A news alert about last week's accident on Highway 9. The story had finally hit. The local media security camera footage from a nearby business had captured the moment Ethan pulled her from the car, the explosion seconds later. Dramatic, heroic, the kind of human interest story that news outlets loved. Local handyman saves tech CEO from burning car, read the headline. Alexandra's stomach dropped. She clicked through to the full article. There was Ethan's face captured in grainy security footage, carrying her away from the wreck. The article listed his name, mentioned his small handyman business, speculated about his background. Her phone started ringing immediately. Marcus's extension. "Miss Hayes, we're getting media requests about the accident, about the man who saved you. Do you want to comment? No. But no statements. No comments. No interviews. Tell them I value my privacy and want to respect his privacy as well. They're offering substantial sums for an exclusive." I said no. Marcus, protect his information. If anyone tries to contact him through this company, you personally intervene. Am I clear? Crystal clear, Miss Hayes. She hung up and immediately texted Ethan. I'm sorry about the media attention. I've instructed my staff to shut it down. Your privacy matters. No response. She hadn't expected one. Alexandra stared at her phone for a long moment, then made another decision. Pulled up her contractor on speed dial. Henry. I need a house inspected. Full assessment, top to bottom, no detail too small. And I need it done quietly. She gave him Ethan's address. If she couldn't give him money directly, she could at least make sure the house he was renting was safe. Make sure the landlord, now her, was maintaining the property properly. Make sure he and Sophie weren't living somewhere that would fail a safety inspection. It was a small thing. Probably wouldn't even make a difference. But it was something, and something was better than the helpless gratitude that had been eating at her for days. That evening, alone in her own apartment, a penthouse that cost more than most people made in a year, filled with furniture she barely used, and art she'd bought because her decorator said she should. Alexandra stood at the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere down there, Ethan Brooks was probably on his lumpy couch trying to fall asleep after another 15-hour day, his daughter safe in the next room, his dignity intact, even though his bank account was empty. And Alexandra Hayes, who could solve any problem with money, who'd built an empire on strategic thinking and careful planning, couldn't figure out how to help the one person who actually mattered. She thought about foster care, about the 15 homes, the feeling of never quite belonging, of being a burden no one really wanted, about learning to be self-sufficient because depending on others only led to disappointment, about building walls so high that nobody could hurt her, nobody could leave her, nobody could reject her. Ethan Brooks had rejected her, and somehow that had shaken those walls more than anything in the past 10 years. At 11 p.m. on Friday night, Alexandra Hayes sat at her desk with her third cup of coffee and admitted to herself that what she was doing probably crossed several ethical lines. She'd started with a simple Google search, Ethan Brooks handyman local area, found his Craigslist listings, his profile on a handyman referral site, his sparse digital footprint. No social media, no Facebook, no Instagram, no Twitter. No online presence beyond the basics required to run a small business. So she'd moved to public records. Property records showed he'd been renting the house on Riverside Avenue for 3 years. Before that, he'd owned a home in a nicer neighborhood, sold in a short sale 3 years ago, purchased 8 years before that. Marriage records showed he'd married Jessica Ann Brennan 6 years ago. Divorce records showed she'd filed 3 years ago, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting sole custody initially, before settling for 0 custody and 0 visitation in the final decree. Driver's license information gave her his age 37 and his previous address. Vehicle registration showed the 1998 Ford truck registration current, but with a flagged emissions test. Then she went deeper. Employment records were trickier, but her connections in HR departments across the city helped. She found his work history, Brooks & Sons Engineering until 4 years ago. Structural engineer, good salary benefits, steady employment. Then the company filed for bankruptcy, and Ethan was let go. After that, gaps. 2 months unemployed. Then a series of short-term positions: construction worker, maintenance technician, finally settling on self-employment as a licensed handyman. The picture formed slowly, painfully, a man who'd had a normal, stable, middle-class life until everything collapsed at once. Company failed, marriage failed, everything he'd built, gone. And somehow he'd kept going, kept his daughter, kept his head above water through sheer, stubborn determination and constant work. Alexandra pulled up his business reviews next, dozens of them spanning 3 years. She read them obsessively, looking for patterns. Fixed my sink for $40 when another guy quoted $200. Honest work, fair prices. Noticed my water heater was dangerous and fixed it for free because I'm elderly and on a fixed income. This man is a saint. Best handyman in the city. Refuses tips, never overcharges, shows up exactly when he says he will. Helped me with a plumbing emergency at midnight when my basement was flooding. Didn't charge extra for the late hour. Cannot recommend enough. The theme was consistent. Ethan Brooks was honest to a fault, undercharged rather than overcharged. Noticed problems and fixed them without being asked. Treated everyone with respect regardless of their ability to pay. He was exactly who he'd appeared to be in that living room confrontation, a man with principles so deeply ingrained that money couldn't shake them. Alexandra closed her laptop and sat in the dark of her office, staring at nothing. In her world, everyone had a price. That was business. You figured out what someone wanted and you gave it to them, and in return they gave you what you wanted. Simple, transactional, clean. But Ethan Brooks didn't fit that pattern. He'd turned down $3,000 cash, had thrown it back in her face essentially because taking it would violate some code of ethics she couldn't fully grasp. Most people talked about integrity. Ethan Brooks lived it. Her phone buzzed. A text from her property acquisition team: Riverside Property Management paperwork complete. You're now the official owner of 24 residential units. Congratulations. Alexandra pulled up the tenant list. Found Ethan's name, his unit number, his monthly rent, $725. Then she made a phone call she knew she shouldn't make. This is Hayes. I need you to pull the maintenance records for Unit 7 at the Riverside Avenue property. Complete history, every request, every repair, everything. The records came through 15 minutes later. Alexandra read them with growing anger. Requests for repairs submitted over 3 years, 17. Repairs actually completed by the previous management company, 4. The rest had been marked tenant elected to handle personally in exchange for rent reduction. In other words, Ethan had been fixing problems that the landlord should have fixed just to keep his rent affordable. Leaky roof, he'd patched it himself. Broken water heater, he'd replaced it. Electrical issues, he'd rewired circuits. Cracked foundation, he'd sealed it. The previous property management company had been exploiting him, taking advantage of his skills and his desperate need for affordable housing, letting him do hundreds of dollars of work in exchange for maybe $50 off his monthly rent. Alexandra made another call. I need contractors at Unit 7 Riverside Avenue. Full inspection every system. I want a list of everything that needs repair, no matter how small. And I want it done yesterday. Miss Hayes, it's 11 p.m. Then they'll work through the night. I want the report by morning. She hung up, her mind racing. This wasn't charity. This was being a decent landlord, making sure properties were safe and up to code. It was basic responsibility, the kind any property owner should take seriously. That it also happened to help Ethan Brooks was just convenient. Alexandra pulled up her calendar. Tomorrow was Saturday. She had a board dinner she was supposed to attend, some networking event with potential investors. She cancelled it with a text to her assistant. Tomorrow she was going back to Riverside Avenue. This time, she wouldn't offer money. She'd offer something better, a landlord who actually fulfilled her obligations. And if Ethan Brooks wanted to refuse that, well, he could try. But Alexandra Hayes didn't get to the top of her industry by taking no for an answer. Saturday morning started the way every Saturday morning did. Ethan woke up at 6 a.m. with a stiff neck from the couch, made coffee with reused grounds, and sat in his kitchen planning the day's work. He had 2 guaranteed jobs, a clogged drain on the north side, and a fence repair for the Hendersons, plus a maybe job if Mrs. Patterson's shower was still acting up. If all 3 happened, he'd clear $120. If only 2 happened, maybe $80. Enough to buy Sophie those shoes from the thrift store and still have a little left over for groceries. Sophie stumbled out of her room at 7 Hair Wild, still in her dinosaur pajamas. "Morning, Daddy. Morning, sunshine." He slid her a plate of toast, 1 slice butter scraped thin. "We're doing shoes today, remember? Can we go to the park?" after Sophie asked around a mouthful of toast. Maddie said she might be there. Ethan did the mental math. Park meant gas to drive there, and the thrift store was on the other side of town from the park, which meant more gas, and his tank was already down to a quarter. But Sophie so rarely asked for anything. "Sure, baby. After I finish the Henderson job, okay?" She beamed at him, and the tightness in Ethan's chest loosened a fraction. They spent the morning together. Ethan took Sophie with him to the clogged drain job. The client didn't mind, said she had kids of her own, and understood single parenting. Sophie sat on the client's porch and drew pictures while Ethan snaked the drain, pulled out a disgusting mass of hair and soap build-up, and collected his $40. Then the Henderson fence repair with Sophie, handing him tools and asking a million questions about why fences needed posts, and couldn't they just lean against the house? Ethan answered every question patiently, grateful for her curiosity. Her engagement, the way she made boring manual labor feel like an adventure. They finished at 2 p.m. Ethan collected his $50, declined Mrs. Henderson's offer of cookies because accepting food from clients felt too close to charity, and drove Sophie to the thrift store. She found shoes in the 3rd box. They looked through pink sneakers, slightly worn but structurally sound, only $6. Sophie tried them on, walked around the store testing them, declared them perfect. "Actually perfect, Daddy." Ethan paid with exact change, watched Sophie skip out to the truck in her new shoes, and felt that familiar mix of pride and defeat. Pride that he'd provided. Defeat that providing meant buying second-hand shoes and calling it a victory. They went to the park. Sophie ran straight to the playground, where Maddie and 2 other kids were playing some elaborate game involving the jungle gym and apparently pirates. Ethan sat on a bench nearby, keeping half an eye on Sophie and half an eye on his phone, checking for new job requests. Nothing. Saturday afternoons were slow. His mind drifted back to Alexandra Hayes, despite his best efforts not to think about her. Wondered what she was doing right now. Probably something expensive, fancy lunch, charity event, whatever people with money did on Saturdays. Probably not sitting on a cracked park bench watching her kid play in thrift store shoes. 2 completely different worlds. No reason for them to intersect beyond that one night, that one rescue. He'd saved her life, and she'd tried to pay him, and he'd refused, and that should have been the end of it. Should have been. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Probably a spam call, but he answered anyway because you never knew when it might be a potential client. "Is this Ethan Brooks?" The voice was professional. Female, unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Riverside Property Management. We're calling to inform you that there's been a change in ownership of your rental property. The new owner would like to schedule a property inspection for tomorrow Sunday at 10 a.m. Is that time suitable for you?" Ethan's stomach dropped. Change in ownership. Property inspection. What kind of inspection? Routine maintenance assessment. The new owner wants to ensure all properties meet safety standards. This is complimentary, no cost to you as the tenant. We just need access to the property. Tomorrow is Sunday, Ethan said, thinking about the jobs he'd already lined up, the money he couldn't afford to lose. The new owner is very insistent on this timeline. If 10 a.m. doesn't work, we can try for later in the afternoon. Ethan glanced at Sophie, who was hanging upside down from the monkey bars laughing with Maddie. 10 a.m. is fine. Excellent. Someone will be there tomorrow morning. Have a good day, Mr. Brooks. The call ended. Ethan stared at his phone, a bad feeling settling in his gut. New owner. Sudden inspection. Tomorrow. None of this felt right. Property managers didn't do sudden weekend inspections unless something was wrong. Unless they were looking for a reason to raise rent or evict tenants or... He pushed the thought away. Couldn't afford to panic about hypotheticals. Would deal with tomorrow when tomorrow came. Daddy, watch! Sophie called from the top of the slide. Watch me go down backward. Ethan watched, applauded, tried to focus on the present moment. But the bad feeling lingered all afternoon through dinner with spaghetti, with the last of the sauce through bath time, through the bedtime story where Sophie fell asleep halfway through, and Ethan had to carry her to bed. He lay on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what fresh crisis tomorrow would bring. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear. Ethan was up at 7, not because he'd slept well, but because he'd barely slept at all. He'd spent the night worrying about the inspection, running through every possible scenario. What if the new owner wanted to raise the rent? What if they'd decided these properties were worth more and were planning to kick out all the low-income tenants to renovate and charge market rates? He couldn't afford market rent, couldn't afford to move. Moving meant deposits and moving trucks and time off work he didn't have. By 9 a.m. he'd cleaned the house thoroughly, even though the inspection was supposedly about maintenance, not cleanliness. Put away Sophie's toys, wiped down the kitchen counters, made sure nothing looked worse than it was. Sophie sensed his anxiety and got quiet, curling up on the couch with Mr. Trunk and her drawing pad, making herself small. At 9:55, Ethan stood at the front window watching the street. At 9:58, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. At 10:00 exactly, Alexandra Hayes stepped out of the car. Ethan's first thought was, no. His second thought was, of course. His third thought was such a rush of anger and confusion, and something that felt uncomfortably like relief that he couldn't pass it into words. She was dressed more casually today, jeans, white blouse, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. But still polished, still perfect, still so clearly from a different world than the one Ethan inhabited. She walked up his cracked driveway carrying a leather folder, her expression carefully neutral. Ethan opened the door before she could knock. "You bought my building," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact that was really an accusation. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." Alexandra replied, her tone professional and carefully controlled. "May I come in? We need to discuss property maintenance. You bought my building." Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "You bought the entire building just to what forced me to accept your help. Make some grand gesture. Actually, I bought 24 units as a portfolio investment. Your unit happens to be one of them." She met his eyes steadily. "And I'm here because my inspection team discovered that the previous property management company has been negligent in fulfilling basic maintenance obligations. Several of these properties, including yours, have safety violations that need immediate attention. So this is about being a responsible landlord, Mr. Brooks. Nothing more?" The lie was so obvious, so transparent, that Ethan almost laughed. But then Sophie appeared in the doorway behind him, peeking around his legs to see who was there. Ms. Alex Sophie's face lit up with genuine delight. "You came back?" Alexandra's professional mask cracked. Just for a second, just enough for Ethan to see something soft and vulnerable underneath. She knelt down to Sophie's level. "Hi, Sophie. I hope you don't mind me visiting. Your daddy and I need to talk about some boring grown-up things." "That's okay. Boring grown-up things are better than boring alone things." Sophie looked up at Ethan. "Can Ms. Alex stay for lunch?" "We're having grilled cheese." Ethan wanted to say no, wanted to close the door. Refuse the inspection, keep his pride intact. But Sophie was looking at Alexandra with such open, trusting happiness, the way she used to look at her mother before Jessica left. And Alexandra was looking at Sophie with something in her eyes that made Ethan's anger falter. Not pity, something closer to recognition, like Sophie reminded her of someone. "Ms. Alex has a lot of important work to do," Ethan said carefully. "She probably doesn't have time." "Actually," Alexandra interrupted, standing up but keeping her eyes on Sophie. "Grilled cheese sounds lovely, if your father doesn't mind." She looked at Ethan then, and he saw the challenge there. "The question, are you going to let your pride hurt your daughter? Are you going to make Sophie feel like she's not allowed to have a friend over because of your issues with me?" Damn her. "Fine," Ethan said, stepping back to let her in. "But we talk about this, about all of this. I wouldn't expect anything less." Alexandra Hayes sat at Ethan's small kitchen table, her leather folder open in front of her, while Sophie made elaborate grilled cheese sandwiches at the stove, under her father's watchful supervision. The domesticity of the scene would have been charming, if not for the tension crackling between the two adults like static electricity. The inspection team found 12 code violations. Alexandra said, pulling out a typed report. Faulty wiring in the bedroom, inadequate insulation in the attic, a gas leak in the water heater that's frankly terrifying structural damage to the foundation, and a roof that should have been replaced 3 years ago. Ethan felt his stomach drop. He'd known about most of these problems, had tried to patch them himself when he could, had lived with them when he couldn't. But hearing them listed out like that, official and damning, made them feel more real, more dangerous. "I've been managing." "You've been making do with dangerous conditions because the previous property management company was too cheap to fulfill their legal obligations." Alexandra's voice was firm, but not unkind. "This isn't your fault, Mr. Brooks, but it is my responsibility now, and I take that seriously." She slid a document across the table. "I've already contracted repairs for all 24 units. Work begins tomorrow. The contractors will need access to your unit during the day for the next week. I've arranged for the electrical and gas work to be done. First, those are the immediate safety hazards." Ethan stared at the document. Saw the scope of work, the timeline, the estimated costs. Saw his monthly rent listed at the bottom, $725 unchanged. "What's the catch?" he asked quietly. Alexandra met his eyes. "No catch. This is basic property maintenance. These repairs should have been done years ago. And my rent stays the same." "Yes." "Even though you're putting thousands of dollars into the property. That's how landlording works when you do it ethically, Mr. Brooks. You maintain the property. You ensure it's safe and livable. You don't profit off of tenants living in dangerous conditions." Sophie arrived at the table with a plate of grilled cheese cut into triangles, the way she thought looked fancy. "Here you go, Ms. Alex. I made it extra cheesy." "Thank you, sweetheart. It looks delicious." Alexandra accepted the sandwich with genuine warmth. Took a bite, made appreciative sounds that made Sophie beam with pride. Ethan watched the interaction, feeling his carefully constructed walls cracking. Alexandra wasn't performing kindness for his benefit. She genuinely liked Sophie. That was clear in the way she engaged with his daughter. No condescension, no performative sweetness, just authentic interest. After they ate, and Ethan had to admit Sophie's grilled cheese was pretty good, Sophie went back to her room to play, leaving the adults alone again. "I can't accept this." Ethan said, gesturing to the repair documents. Alexandra set down her water glass with more force than necessary. Excuse me, these repairs. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't accept this level of intervention. It's not intervention, it's basic maintenance. Stop. Ethan stood up, needing to move, needing space. Stop pretending this is normal landlord behavior. You bought this entire property portfolio specifically because I live here. You're doing thousands of dollars of repairs specifically because you want to help me. This is the money thing all over again, just in a different form. Alexandra stood too, her professional composure cracking. And what's the alternative? I let you keep living in a house with faulty wiring and gas leaks? I ignore my legal obligations as a property owner because accepting help hurts your pride? Is that what you want? I want? Ethan stopped, running his hands through his hair. I want to take care of my daughter myself. I want to not feel like I'm failing every single day. I want to not owe anyone anything. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. The words burst out of him, 3 years of desperation and exhaustion and grinding poverty pouring out in a rush. I saved your life, and now you're trying to save mine, and I don't want to be saved. I want to do this myself, even if it's hard, even if I'm barely surviving, because at least it's mine. At least I'm doing it on my own terms. The silence that followed was absolute. Sophie had stopped humming in her room. The refrigerator's hum seemed too loud. Alexandra stared at Ethan with something in her eyes that looked like understanding, like recognition of a wound she herself carried. I grew up in foster care, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. 15 different homes in 16 years. Do you know what that teaches you? That accepting help means becoming someone's burden. That needing things makes you weak. That independence is the only safety you have, because people will always let you down eventually. She took a step closer. I built Hayes Industries from nothing. Worked 3 jobs through college. Slept in my car some nights because I couldn't afford rent and tuition. Made my first $1 million by 25 and my first $10 million by 30. And you know what I learned? That money doesn't actually solve the problem. The problem is the fear. The fear that if you need someone, they'll leave. The fear that accepting help means admitting you're not enough on your own. Ethan felt something in his chest loosen. So you do understand. I understand better than you think. But I also learned something else. Alexandra's voice softened. I learned that sometimes refusing help isn't strength. It's just another form of fear. Fear that if someone helps you, you'll owe them. Fear that accepting kindness means losing yourself. That's not... Isn't it? She gestured around his small kitchen at the worn cabinets and cracked linoleum. You're living in a house with gas leaks because accepting repairs from me feels like giving up your autonomy. You're sleeping on a couch because spending money on a real bed for yourself feels selfish when Sophie needs things. You're working yourself to exhaustion because slowing down might mean you're not trying hard enough. The accuracy of her observations hit like physical blows. Ethan sank back into his chair. What do you want from me? He asked, and he hated how defeated he sounded, how close to breaking. Alexandra sat down across from him. I want you to let me be a decent landlord. I want you to let me fix the things that should have been fixed years ago. And I want you to stop seeing it as charity and start seeing it as basic human decency. And what do I give you in return? Nothing. You give me nothing. That's the point. She paused, seemed to be weighing her next words carefully. Ethan, you saved my life. I will carry that debt forever. But this, she gestured to the repair documents, this isn't about that debt. This is about me discovering that I own properties where people are living in unsafe conditions and choosing to fix that. You benefit. So do 23 other families. But it's not about you specifically. The logic was sound. The explanation was reasonable. And Ethan wanted so badly to believe it. "Okay," he said finally, the word feeling like surrender and relief at the same time. "Okay, you can do the repairs, thank you." But he held up a hand. "I pay the same rent. You don't lower it, you don't waive it. I maintain my financial obligation. That's non-negotiable." "Agreed. And I help with the repairs. I'm a licensed contractor. I can assist your crew, which will save you money on labor costs." Alexandra considered this. "I'd need to clear it with my insurance, but actually that makes sense. Your skills for reduced labor hours. It's a fair trade." "Equal partners," Ethan said. "Not charity. Partnership. Equal partners." Alexandra agreed and extended her hand across the table. Ethan took it. Her grip was firm, her palm warm. They shook on it, and something shifted in the air between them. Not resolution exactly, but the beginning of understanding. The first real conversation they'd had that didn't end in anger or hurt feelings. Sophie appeared in the doorway, Mr. Trunk dangling from one hand. "Are you guys done fighting?" "We weren't fighting," Ethan said automatically. "You were doing the loud, quiet voice thing. That's fighting for grown-ups." Sophie looked between them. "But are you friends now?" Ethan glanced at Alexandra, found her looking back at him with something like amusement in her eyes, softening the intensity that had defined their previous interactions. "Yeah, baby," Ethan said. "We're friends now." The repairs started on Monday morning. A crew of 4 contractors showed up at 8 a.m. with trucks full of tools and materials, professional and efficient. Ethan had already dropped Sophie at school and returned home wearing his work clothes, ready to make good on his promise to assist. The crew chief, a man named Carlos, mid-40s, with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude, looked Ethan up and down. "You're the tenant, and a licensed contractor. Ms. Hayes arranged for me to assist with the work." Carlos pulled out his phone, made a call. Spoke briefly in Spanish, then handed the phone to Ethan. "Boss wants to talk to you." Ethan took the phone. "Hello, Mr. Brooks." Alexandra's voice was crisp and professional, with none of the vulnerability from yesterday. "Carlos is going to brief you on the work schedule. I trust you'll follow his lead. He's been doing this for 20 years and knows what he's doing. I'm not trying to take over, I know. But I need to make sure everyone's on the same page. Safety protocols, insurance requirements, timeline, expectations. Carlos will cover all of it. Call me if you have questions." She hung up. Ethan handed the phone back to Carlos, who was watching him with assessing eyes. "You really know your way around electrical?" Carlos asked. 12 years as a structural engineer, 3 years as a handyman. I've rewired half the houses in this neighborhood." "Good. We're short-handed this week. You can assist Miguel with the bedroom wiring, but you follow his lead, understand? This is my crew, my rules." "Understood." They worked together for the next 6 hours. Ethan following Miguel's instructions, learning the crew's rhythm, proving himself capable. By lunchtime, Carlos was asking his opinion on the foundation repairs. By mid-afternoon, they were joking around like colleagues instead of strangers. It felt good. Better than good. Ethan had forgotten what it was like to work alongside other professionals, to be part of a team instead of always working alone. The camaraderie, the shared purpose, the satisfaction of doing skilled work well, he'd missed this more than he'd realized. At 3 he left to pick up Sophie from school. Found her waiting at the usual spot. Backpack slung over one shoulder, talking animatedly with Maddie about some school project. "How was your day, baby?" "Good, we're doing presentations on career day, and I told everyone my daddy is a contractor and he's fixing our whole house." The pride in her voice made Ethan's throat tight. "That's great sunshine." In the truck, Sophie chatted about school while Ethan drove, but then she went quiet. He glanced over. She was biting her lip the way she did when she wanted to ask something but wasn't sure she should. "What's on your mind?" he prompted. Is Ms. Alex your girlfriend? Ethan almost swerved into the next lane. What? No. Why would you think that? Because she comes to our house and she's helping with stuff, and you guys were fighting yesterday. But then you were friends, and that's what happens in movies when people are going to be boyfriend and girlfriend. Sophie, Ms. Alex is just... She's our landlord. She's making sure the house is safe. That's all. But do you like her? Ethan thought about how to answer that. About Alexandra sitting at their kitchen table eating Sophie's grilled cheese. About the way she'd looked when she talked about foster care, that raw honesty. About how she'd somehow understood his pride even when it was irrational. She's complicated, he said finally. But yeah, I like her. As a person, not as a girlfriend. Okay, Sophie said, but her tone suggested she didn't quite believe him. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from Alexandra Carlos says you're good, really good. He wants to know if you're interested in more contract work with his crew. Ethan stared at the message. More contract work meant more money. Reliable income. Real work with a professional crew instead of endless small handyman jobs. How much more, he texted back. He has several projects lined up. Could be 20-30 hours a week if you want it. Pays better than solo handyman work. I can send you his contact info if you're interested. 20 to 30 hours a week. At contractor rates instead of handyman rates. With Sophie in school during the day. It could work. It could actually work. Yes, he typed. I'm interested. Her response came immediately. Good. You deserve to use your actual skills instead of just fixing toilets. Something about that message, the recognition that he was capable of more than he'd been doing, the acknowledgement that he'd been underemployed, hit Ethan harder than expected. Thank you, he typed. Then because it felt inadequate. For everything. The repairs, the job connection, all of it. I know I haven't made it easy. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, you made it exactly as hard as it needed to be. Your integrity isn't a flaw, Ethan. It's one of the things I respect most about you. Ethan read that message 3 times before responding. Does this mean we're actually friends now? I think it might. Though I've never had a friend who yelled at me for trying to give them money. First time for everything. Apparently. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Alex. He set his phone down and lay back on the couch staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Outside he could hear the distant sound of traffic, the wind in the trees. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan Brooks felt like maybe, just maybe, things were starting to look up. 3 weeks into the repairs, Ethan found himself establishing a routine that felt almost normal. He'd drop Sophie at schoolwork with Carlos's crew until 2 p.m. Pick Sophie up, spend the evening being dad. The work was good, challenging, but not overwhelming using skills he'd thought he'd lost. The pay was better than anything he'd made as a solo handyman. For the first time since the divorce, he was building savings instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. Alexandra had taken to stopping by the work sites once or twice a week, checking progress, asking questions. Always professional, always appropriate. But there was something else now. Something that hadn't been there before. Ease. Friendship, maybe, though Ethan wasn't sure when that had happened. On a Thursday afternoon, after the crew had finished for the day, Alexandra arrived just as Ethan was packing up his tools. Coffee, she asked. There's a place 2 blocks from here. My treat before you argue, it's a business expense. We need to discuss the timeline for the remaining properties. Ethan almost refused on principle. Then realized he was being ridiculous. It was just coffee. And they did need to discuss the timeline. Sure, he said. But I'm buying my own coffee. Of course you are, Alexandra said, and there was amusement in her voice that made Ethan smile despite himself. The coffee shop was one of those local places that served expensive lattes with art in the foam. Ethan ordered plain coffee, black, no sugar, and tried not to wince when the barista said, "That'll be $4.50. $4.50 for coffee. Ridiculous." They sat at a corner table and for a few minutes just drank in comfortable silence. Then Alexandra said, "Carlos tells me you're the best worker he's had in years. He wants to offer you a permanent position with his crew." Ethan looked up from his coffee. "Permanent full-time. Benefits. Steady salary. He's expanding his business and needs reliable people." She paused. "I didn't tell him to offer you the job, if that's what you're wondering. This is purely his decision based on your work." I wasn't wondering that, Ethan said, and realized it was true. A month ago he would have immediately suspected manipulation. Now he believed her. That's really good news. You're going to take it. I'd be stupid not to." Ethan ran his hand through his hair. "Steady income benefits. Sophie hasn't had healthcare in 2 years because I couldn't afford the premiums. This would change everything. Then I'm happy for you." Alexandra's smile was genuine. "You deserve stability, Ethan. You've worked hard enough for it." They fell into conversation after that. Easy conversation, the kind that flowed without effort. Alexandra told him about the other properties she was renovating, about discovering that property management was more complicated than she'd expected, about finding satisfaction in fixing something tangible instead of just making investments on paper. Ethan told her about Sophie's latest obsession, marine biology of all things, and how his 8-year-old daughter now knew more about octopuses than he did. Told her about the science project Sophie was working on, about the challenges of single parenting when you were always exhausted. "What about Sophie's mom?" Alexandra asked gently. "Is she involved at all?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "No. She left 3 years ago, said motherhood wasn't what she expected. Pays child support sometimes when she remembers. Hasn't seen Sophie since she walked out. That must have been hard. For both of you. Sophie cried for her every night for 6 months, asked when Mommy was coming home why Mommy didn't love her anymore. I didn't know how to explain that her mother chose to leave. How do you tell a 5-year-old that sometimes people just give up?" Alexandra reached across the table, covered his hand with hers. The gesture was instinctive comforting. "You tell her that her mother's inability to be a parent says everything about her mother and nothing about Sophie. That she is enough has always been enough. And that the people who matter will always stay." Ethan looked at their joined hands, at the way her fingers rested lightly on his. "That's good advice. I had to learn it myself. Foster care teaches you that lesson early. People leave. It's what they do. The question is whether you let that destroy you or whether you learn to be enough for yourself. Is that what you did? Learned to be enough for yourself?" Alexandra pulled her hand back, wrapped it around her coffee cup. "I learned to not need anyone. That's different. Safer maybe, but lonelier." "Do you get lonely?" The question slipped out before Ethan could stop it. "Sorry, that's too personal." "Yes," Alexandra said simply. "I have employees, colleagues, business associates, but friends. Real friends who know me beyond the CEO persona, I can't think of a single one." She looked at him. "Until recently, maybe." The weight of that admission hung between them. Ethan thought about his own isolation. The way he'd pulled away from friends after the divorce, embarrassed by his failure, too proud to accept help. The way he'd made himself small and self-sufficient and alone. "We're a pair, aren't we?" he said softly. "Both of us so determined to not need anyone that we've cut ourselves off from everyone." "Maybe that's changing," Alexandra said. "For both of us." They stayed in the coffee shop for 2 hours, talking about everything and nothing, about childhoods and disappointments and the weird little victories that made hard days bearable. By the time they left, something had shifted. The friendship that had been forming tentative and uncertain felt more solid now, more real. Outside the coffee shop, they stood awkwardly on the sidewalk. Alexandra opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. Started again. Would you and Sophie want to come to dinner? At my place, I know it's probably weird, but I'd like her to see where I live. And I'd like to cook for someone other than myself for once. Ethan thought about Sophie asking if Alexandra was his girlfriend. Thought about crossing that line from professional acquaintance to actual friends who visited each other's homes. Thought about how easy it would be to say no to keep that boundary intact. When he heard himself ask, Saturday. If you're free, we're free, Ethan said. What should we bring? Just yourselves, and maybe Sophie's marine biology facts. I'd love to hear them. They parted ways then, and Ethan drove to pick up Sophie with a strange lightness in his chest. Like maybe, just maybe, he was allowed to have this. Allowed to have a friend. Allowed to let someone in without it meaning failure. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after the accident on Highway 9, the Foster Transition Foundation officially launched at a small ceremony in a community center downtown. Not fancy, not expensive, just real. Ethan stood beside Alexandra as she gave her speech. Sophie on his other side, listening to Alexandra talk about foster care, about aging out of the system, about the fear and uncertainty and desperate need for support. I was lucky, Alexandra said. I had intelligence, determination, and enough anger to fuel me through college and beyond. But not everyone has that. Not everyone can bootstrap their way out of poverty, and they shouldn't have to. That's what this foundation is for, to provide the support I needed and didn't have. To give 18-year-olds facing the world alone a safety net and a fighting chance. The room erupted in applause. Several former foster youth in the audience were crying. Alexandra's eyes were wet too as she stepped down from the podium. Ethan pulled her into a hug. You did good. We did good. This was your idea too. It was true. Over the past weeks, Ethan had helped shape the foundation's mission, drawing on his own experience of struggling to survive and raise Sophie. His perspective that help needed to preserve dignity, that support should build independence instead of dependence, had shaped every program they designed. After the ceremony, as they cleaned up the community center, Sophie tugged on Alexandra's sleeve. Ms. Alex, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Are you going to be my mom? The room went silent. Ethan froze mid-fold of a tablecloth. Alexandra knelt down to Sophie's level. What makes you ask that? Because you and Daddy are together now, and you come over all the time, and you make him smile the way he used to smile in old pictures with my other mom, so I thought maybe you'd be my mum too. Alexandra glanced at Ethan, who gave her a small nod. Your call. Sophie, I care about you and your daddy very much, but being someone's mum is a really big responsibility. I want to make sure I do it right. So how about this? I'll be your friend first, your very good friend who will always be there. And if someday you want to call me Mom, we can talk about it then. Is that okay? Sophie considered this seriously. That's okay. I like having you as my friend. You're my best adult friend. You're my best 8-year-old friend, Alexandra said, pulling her into a hug. Later, after Sophie was asleep in the car on the drive home, Ethan reached over and took Alexandra's hand. Thank you for not promising her something we're not ready for yet. We're not ready, Alexandra agreed. But I want to get there. To being ready. To being a family. Me too. They drove in comfortable silence, hands linked across the console, Sophie asleep in the back seat, and it felt like the beginning of something real. Something lasting. Something worth all the fear and vulnerability and complicated negotiations of two broken people learning to be whole together. 6 months passed. Spring turned to summer summit, to fall. Jessica's petition was denied. The judge ruled that sudden reappearance after years of absence, even with sobriety, didn't constitute changed circumstances warranting court-ordered visitation. Sophie could choose to see her mother when she was older if she wanted, but it would be her choice, not the court's, not Jessica's. The Foster Transition Foundation helped 23 young adults find housing and jobs in its first 6 months. 3 went back to college. 5 started vocational training. All of them had someone to call when things got hard. Alexandra sold her penthouse and bought a house closer to Ethan's neighborhood. Nothing ostentatious, just a 3-bedroom with a yard close enough to walk to his place, far enough to maintain some independence. Ethan's work with Carlos's crew had turned into a full partnership. He was training younger contractors, designing projects using his engineering skills properly for the first time in years. The financial stability was almost unsettling, not wealthy, but comfortable. Sophie had new shoes that fit health insurance and a college fund that was actually growing. They didn't rush, didn't push, just let the relationship develop naturally. Dinners together, movie nights, hiking trips. Sophie included in everything because she was part of this always. On a Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after the accident on Highway 9, Ethan and Alexandra stood by the oak tree where he'd pulled her from the wreck. Someone had placed a small memorial there, flowers a note thanking the unknown hero who'd saved a life. "A year ago I thought my life was ending," Alexandra said, touching the scarred bark. "Trapped in that car, smoke filling my lungs, fire spreading. And then you were there." "A year ago I thought my life was just about survival," Ethan replied. "Getting through each day, taking care of Sophie, not thinking about anything beyond the next rent payment. I wasn't living, just existing." And now Ethan looked at her. This woman who'd walked into his life wearing his shirt, offering money he couldn't take, pushing every boundary he had while somehow respecting them at the same time. Now I'm living, really living. For the first time in years, I'm not just surviving. I'm happy. "Me too," Alexandra said. She pulled a small box from her pocket. "I have something for you. An anniversary present." Ethan opened it to find a key. "What's this key to my house? Not to move in, we're not ready for that. But so you know you're always welcome. That you have a place beyond your own walls. That you're not alone anymore." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He pulled out his own small box. "I got you something too." Inside was a keychain with a photo, Sophie and Alexandra laughing together at the lake house, both of them soaking wet from a kayaking mishap, pure joy on their faces. "So you remember Ethan said that you have people who love you, who want you around, who aren't going to leave." Alexandra's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, I love you," he said. "Sophie loves you. We want you in our lives, permanently. However that looks, whatever pace we need to take, I want you there. I love you too. Both of you." She kissed him soft and certain. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for saving mine." They stood by the tree that had almost been Alexandra's end and Ethan's turning point, and they held each other while the October wind scattered leaves around them like confetti. A year ago, neither of them had known what was coming. Hadn't known that one crash, one rescue, one moment of choosing to stop instead of driving past would lead them here. But here they were, broken pieces that had somehow fit together into something whole and beautiful, and worth every difficulty it took to get here. Here, together. Home. 18 months after the accident, Ethan bought a ring. It wasn't expensive. He couldn't afford the kind of ring someone like Alexandra could buy herself. But it was thoughtful, a simple silver band with a small sapphire Sophie's birthstone, because this wasn't just about him and Alexandra. It was about becoming a family. He showed it to Sophie first. What do you think? Sophie looked at the ring with serious eyes. Are you going to ask Ms. Alex to marry you? I'm thinking about it. But only if you're okay with it. Will she be my mom? Probably, eventually, if that's what you want. Sophie thought about it for a long moment. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that lit up her whole face. I think I'd like that. She makes you happy. And she's really nice to me. And she knows about octopuses. Those are very good reasons, Ethan agreed, smiling. When are you going to ask her? Soon. But I need your help with something. The wedding was small. Just close friends, Carlos and his crew. Sophie's friends from school, a few of Alexandra's former colleagues who'd become actual friends. They held it in Alexandra's backyard, not the penthouse she'd sold, but the house she'd bought to be near Ethan. The one with the garden and the porch swing and the lived-in feeling that came from being actually lived in. Sophie was the maid of honor, wearing a blue dress she'd picked out herself, clutching a bouquet of sunflowers and grinning from ear to ear. Ethan stood at the altar, really just an arch of flowers they'd made together, and watched Alexandra walk down the aisle toward him. She wasn't wearing a traditional wedding dress, just a simple white sundress and bare feet in the grass and flowers in her hair. She looked perfect. When she reached him, she whispered, "Hi." "Hi," he whispered back. The officiant, Mrs. Patterson, who'd gotten ordained online specifically for this occasion, cleared her throat. "Dearly beloved." Ethan barely heard the words. He was too busy looking at Alexandra, at Sophie standing beside them, radiating joy at the small group of people who'd become their family. When it came time for vows, Alexandra went first. "Ethan, you taught me that saving someone isn't about money or grand gestures. It's about showing up. Every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. You saved my life that night on Highway 9, but you saved me in a bigger way too. You showed me what it means to build something real. Something that matters more than quarterly reports or stock prices. You taught me that family isn't about blood or paperwork. It's about choice. Choosing each other every single day." She turned to Sophie. "And Sophie, you taught me that it's okay to need people. That accepting love doesn't make you weak. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone in. I promise to be the best stepmother I can be. To listen to your octopus facts no matter how many times you tell me. To show up for every science fair and school play and scraped knee. To love you the way you deserve to be loved." When Alexandra finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the backyard. Ethan took a breath, steadied himself. "Alex, 2 years ago I thought I knew what my life was going to be. Small, careful, just me and Sophie against the world. I thought needing help meant failing. I thought accepting love meant being weak. And then you showed up in my kitchen, wearing my shirt, and you wouldn't take no for an answer." He paused, got a laugh from the guests. "You've pushed every boundary I had. Made me uncomfortable in the best ways. Taught me that pride isn't the same as strength, and accepting help isn't the same as giving up. You made me believe in second chances, in the possibility that broken things can be made whole again if we're brave enough to try." He looked at Sophie, who was trying not to cry and failing. "And you gave Sophie something I couldn't give her alone. You gave her a mother who chose her, who shows up for her, who makes her feel like she's worth loving, not because she's obligated to, but because she genuinely is. I promise to be your partner, your equal, to never stop choosing you, even when it's hard, to let you help me, and to help you in return, to build a life together that's messy and complicated, and absolutely perfect, because it's ours." Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "By the power vested in me by the state and the internet, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ethan, you may kiss your bride." He did. Thoroughly. While Sophie cheered and guests applauded, and somewhere in the universe, maybe his late wife and Alexandra's long-lost parents looked down and smiled at the unexpected family that had formed from a car crash and a rescue and two lonely people brave enough to let each other in. 2 years after the wedding, 4 years after the accident, the Brooks-Hayes household had found its rhythm. Ethan and Alexandra had combined their names because neither wanted to lose their identity. They lived in Alexandra's house, the one near Ethan's old rental, because Sophie hadn't wanted to change schools again. They'd converted the garage into a workshop where Ethan could work on carpentry projects and Sophie could do her increasingly complicated science experiments. Alexandra ran the Foster Transition Foundation full-time now. They'd expanded to 3 cities and helped over 100 young adults transition from foster care to independence. Ethan consulted for them, building affordable housing units specifically for program participants. Sophie was 12 now, still obsessed with marine biology, talking about college programs and oceanography careers. She called Alexandra Mom about half the time, Alex the other half, and nobody minded the inconsistency. Love didn't require labels to be real. On a Saturday morning in November, exactly 4 years after the accident, they drove out to Highway 9 together. The oak tree was still there, scarred but standing. The memorial had been removed, but they brought flowers anyway. 4 years, Alexandra said, standing by the tree. Feels like a lifetime ago and yesterday at the same time. You almost died here, Sophie said seriously. She was old enough now to understand how close it had been, how easily things could have gone differently. Your dad saved me, and you saved him back. They all looked at each other, understanding passing between them. It was true. They'd saved each other not just in the obvious way, but in all the small ways that mattered. Ethan had saved Alexandra from a life of empty success. Alexandra had saved Ethan from drowning in pride and isolation. Together they'd saved Sophie from believing that people always left, that love was always temporary. Come on, Ethan said, pulling them both into a hug. Let's go home. Wait. Sophie pulled out her phone. Family picture first. By the tree where it all started. They posed together, Ethan and Alexandra, with Sophie between them, all of them laughing at something stupid Ethan said right before the timer went off. The photo captured them perfectly messy, happy real. Later that photo would go on the mantel in their living room between the picture from their wedding and the picture from Sophie's 8th grade graduation. It would stay there for decades, a reminder of where they'd come from, of the moment that changed everything. But for now, they just got in the car and drove home, Sophie chattering about her latest biology project, Ethan and Alexandra stealing glances at each other the way married people do when they can't believe they got so lucky. They'd learned what mattered, that families are built, not born, that broken pieces can become something beautiful, that sometimes the best chapters of your life start with the worst nights, that saving someone else is how you save yourself, and that love, real love, the kind that lasts, is a choice you make every single day. Choosing to show up, choosing to stay, choosing each other over and over again no matter what comes. They were home, together, whole. And that was everything. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that broken doesn't mean beyond repair, that second chances exist for those brave enough to take them, that sometimes the person who saves you is the one you save in return. Please don't just watch and walk away. Hit that subscribe button and join our channel family. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their story isn't over, that sometimes the worst moments lead to the most beautiful chapters, that love finds us when we least expect it and need it most. Leave a comment below telling us about a time someone helped you when you needed it most, or a moment when helping someone else changed your life. Your stories matter. They inspire others and remind us all that kindness still exists in this world. Remember, you're never truly alone. Sometimes strangers become family when they're brave enough to let each other in. Sometimes saving someone else is exactly how you save yourself. Sometimes the best thing that ever happened to you starts with the worst thing that ever happened to someone else. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing in stories about real people, real struggles, and real hope. See you in the next video where we'll share another story that proves love always finds a way.